Welcome to the Business of Story podcast, where the world's best storytellers from business, Hollywood, and beyond teach you how to use stories to communicate and connect with your customers. The Business of Story is sponsored by ACT, the best-selling customer management software for small business, and by Signal Labs, the real-time cross-media story tracking platform. Here's your host, Park Howell from Park & Co., and today's special Business of Story guest.
Welcome to the Business of Story, where we help you understand how to use the power of storytelling in your life, whether it's for career advancement, business leadership, brand development, content marketing, sustainability, whatever your mission is life. This podcast is all about how you can use story to advance your missions further, faster. I've got a story for you. I've been working, as you know, with Arizona State University. They came to me a few years ago about helping craft a communications curriculum around a new program called the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership. Our agency, Park & Co., we've been in the business for about 20 years and have been doing a lot of work in cause marketing, social programs, and whatever. So we've had a lot of success with that. They said, can you come in and work with our students, our Executive Masters students, to help teach them what you know about story so that they can advance, their causes. A part of this program, ASU brought in over 30 sustainability executives from around the country to help kind of inform the development of our curriculum. We had four main threads within the curriculum. We had sustainability strategy, global context and systems thinking, sustainability leadership, and then my thread of communications. And one of the things that I found that opened my eyes up that day when they were all in town in Tempe, Arizona, and we were getting their input on what they thought would make the most powerful program, is they all completely dialed into sustainability strategy. And of course, they all had lots of great ideas around global context systems thinking. Many of them were already sustainability leaders, so they had a lot of great input about the leadership thread. But when it came to communications, I found that I would have an audience with a lot of crossed arms looking at me, and I couldn't quite figure out why they weren't connecting with it as much until they started talking about communications, the soft skill. And I explored this a little bit more with them, and what I found is that they were quite dismissive about the communications aspect of sustainability, leadership, and so forth. And I think they looked at it as a gimmick, that storytelling and communications was just more of a gimmick, but really where the tread hits the road is doing in strategy, global context, leadership, and so forth. So that underscored to me that I needed to find even more scientific proof and data that story is very much a part of our biological being and is as important to our survival as our brain, as our heart, and as our lungs. So as I looked around, and you met Jonathan Gottschall in an earlier show talking about the storytelling animal and how we're hardwired for story, I came across Dr. Paul Zach's work in narrative, story development, and how it releases oxytocin in our minds, which is the molecule that brings us trustworthiness, that connects us as social beings and emotional beings. And Paul has done a vast amount of work in this. He's written a wonderful book called The Moral Molecule. He has a fantastic TED Talk. He's got videos and work that backs that up. And so I invited Paul to the show today, and he graciously has taken some time out of his busy summer and has come to tell us about oxytocin. And what do we need to know as business communicators and leaders on how we can get oxytocin released in our audiences to build trustworthy and connections so that, again, we can advance our missions further, faster. So with that, please give a warm welcome out there in podcast land to Dr. Paul Zach. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Park.
So tell us a little bit about your work, starting with your title of a neuroeconomist. What is a neuroeconomist?
So, Park, I know you have never made a bad decision in your life, but your
Exactly.
brother-in-law, who was buying investment real estate in 2007 when everybody else knew it was a bubble, what's the deal with that? So, neuroeconomics is a field that helps start that measures brain activity while people make decisions. And we were particularly interested in social decisions, so how decisions that I make are dependent on what I think you'll do. And we studied things like cooperation and generosity and charity to understand why humans have this kind of sense of who's safe to be around, who to trust, who I want to affiliate with, and if we could identify neural pathways that activate when we're around someone that we want to engage with.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been doing this a long time. You are the director of the Center for Neuroeconomics Studies and professor of economics, psychology, and management at Claremont Graduate University. So tell us a little bit about your work in Oxytocin, and I've got to ask too, how did you end up with a nun as a mother?
Yeah, let's take the second one first, right?
Okay.
For the Catholics out there are sort of levels of being a nun. So there's a novice nun, and then you sort of try out things. And anyway, at some point you have to be all in. It's the same thing for priests, by the way. So they want you to, sort of, try out the lifestyle before you go in. So before she got to the highest level, she decided it wasn't for her. And so anyway, she later met my dad and had kids, and was a wonderful mom. But it kind of growing up in a very Catholic household kind of drove my interest in moral behaviors. And my mom's view is that it says in the Bible, that's what it is. And I kind of wondered why we get good behaviors for people who are not religious or who are Buddhist, or God forbid, people who are Protestant. So anyway, so we began studying moral behaviors in an active way, rather than just asking people, are you a good person? Have you ever given money to the homeless? I don't know. The brain is not great on self-report. We don't know what we do often once it's gone past. We certainly don't know why. So oxytocin is a chemical the brain makes that is classically associated with childbirth and breastfeeding. But in a dozen years of experiments, we showed that when you interact with a stranger who you perceive as safe, who signals to you that he or she is safe or trustworthy, that your brain makes oxytocin, and that motivates you to interact in turn. So reciprocate good for good. So it's kind of the biological substrate of the golden rule.
Is it only found in humans?
Only found in mammals. So it's kind of this golden rule. You treat me nice, my brain makes oxytocin, and most of the time motivates me to treat you nice in return. And of course, the most of the time is where the story gets interesting. But one of the things we wanted to look at was whether this kinds of personal interaction might occur at a distance. And so that's how we began studying story about 10 years ago. We started looking at story as a potential stimulus for oxytocin release because, as you said, we know that stories sometimes change our behaviors, right? We watch a documentary or we see a TV commercial and we get excited about doing something. So we want to connect story to action and identify, again, what makes a good story good, and what are the key factors that motivate action after you hear a story or see a story.
Now, you have a tremendous TED Talk on this that really takes the audience through it, and I highly recommend anybody just go and, of course, search Balzac and TED Talk. You talk about in there something that happened to you in the Pigeon Drop, and I think it is a great example of how, well, you demonstrated the release of oxytocin, and it kind of led you astray, but it's a good example of how folks can use it for good, not evil, too, in our communications work. Can you tell us about the Pigeon Drop?
Right. So when I was 18, I worked at a Arco gas station by the freeway in Central California, and that really gets you really interested in human behavior. I mean, if you work at a gas station for a year, you see, the gangbangers, the drug users, the prostitutes, and you get kind of curious about the humans. And anyway, I was the victim of a classic con called the Pigeon Drop, in which a person claims to find something valuable, in this case jewelry, and someone calls missing that jewelry, and I take the call, but the guy who found it can't wait, and there's a reward, and so he offers to split the reward with me if I just front him, $100, and I'll get the 200 when the guy shows up. So, I think if I were over 18, I wouldn't have probably fallen for that, but I did, and as you said, oxytocin makes us treat people we think are safe in an appropriate way, because there's great value in having a big social community around you, and this good behavior is one way we sustain that social group or sustain ourselves in that social group. So I thought this guy was a upfront guy. He was a good guy, and so I did for the $100. Of course, the jury was cheap-paced, and the guy who claimed to offer the reward never showed up. So, oxytocin can be used to manipulate people. So the subjective experience of your brain making oxytocin is one of empathy, increased empathy. So, when we tell stories, we do often want people to empathize with us or with the characters in the story, and that makes us care about them, care about what happens in the story, how the story resolves. But we are persuading people, and so I think it is important to understand that although we're always trying to persuade the humans around us, that we should do that with some care, because the stories sometimes can be used for ill. ISIS recruiting for people to join their terrorist organization is an example of kind of negative, effective storytelling. And as you may know, we worked a lot with the Department of Defense and the intelligence community on stories to help them understand why stories are persuasive, how to generate counter messages. So it's a real interesting emerging field that we're involved in.
Now, if you study game dynamics, and you hear a lot of people talking about World of Warcraft and some of those other games, and how it helps release, or it absolutely releases cortisol in the players, that really focuses attention, or the neurotransmitter dopamine, which helps well up and trigger optimism. How does oxytocin play with some of those other chemicals in the brain to build that trustworthiness you're talking about?
So it has actually a lot of effects. So first we should say that oxytocin, like many other neurochemicals in your body, is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters are active in the brain and hormones are active outside the brain, roughly. So within the brain, oxytocin is an acute response to a positive social interaction. And one of the key findings that we discovered in 2009, I guess, was that stories can trigger that same effect. But because we're fundamentally interested in actions and not feelings, although, again, oxytocin increases our subjective state of empathy, we found when we used stories that were associated with causes, like we used public service announcements in many of our experiments, and we just identified when stories caused people to donate money they earned in the experiment to the causes featured, even though none of these public service announcements asked for money. They just highlighted causes like don't drink and drive, or childhood cancer, other things. So we found that effective stories had two components. One was attention, and the other was this emotional resonance that's associated with oxytocin release. So all storytellers know that attention is important. Neurologically, attention is a very scarce resource in the brain. And so every storyteller knows that if I don't capture my audience's attention, then I'm unlikely to have any effect at all. What we showed in a variety of experiments is that attention is not sufficient to motivate action after you hear a story. You need both attention and this emotional resonance that's associated with oxytocin release. And the way that occurs is something that storytellers know, and that is by creating a social conflict. So in the sort of classic storytelling mode, the sort of hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, there is a moment of crisis. There's a moment in which the hero cannot resolve what's happening. And many classic short stories, TV commercials, even newspaper advertisements have that same kind of hero's journey structure. And that structure, or more generally sort of a dramatic arc, allows us to maintain attention, but also still care about the characters in the story. So when both those things happen, I'm attending to the story, and when I become emotionally engaged in the story, then I can actually move people to act on the information in the story. So if one of those two aspects is missing, then we find that there's no way to influence people's behavior.
Very interesting. Paul, let's take a break for one of our sponsors' stories, and when we come back, I would like to have you talk about how does story actually work? How does it work in this dramatic arc to release this oxytocin, and how can business folks, how can communicators use it to their advantage for good and not evil, as we pointed out earlier. So we'll be right back after this message with Dr. Paul Zak.
Are you keeping track of sales leads in a spreadsheet, or worse, Post-it notes all over your desk? Well, there's a better way, and it doesn't involve spending a fortune on complex CRM software. For over 25 years, ACT has been the #1 best-selling contact and customer management software. It's super affordable and easy to use. ACT helps individuals, small businesses, and sales teams organize prospect and customer details in just one place. It also helps you market products and services more effectively, and most importantly, it drives sales. Try ACT for 30 days by visiting actstory.com and sign up for a chance to win a pair of Bose Quiet Comfort 20i acoustic noise canceling headphones, a $299 value. Again, that's actstory.com.
Welcome back to the Business of Story, and my guest today, Dr. Paul Zak, neuroeconomist, and the guy that tracked down the moral molecule called oxytocin. And why is oxytocin important for us business communicators? Because when we tell story, use narrative with conflict, we're able to release the moral molecule within our audiences and build trust between them. So, Paul, can you talk to us a little bit about how that happens and why really does story release oxytocin, and how can we be better at that when we are addressing an audience, whether it's a PowerPoint we're delivering, it's content marketing online, it's an ad, whatever it is that we need to do to connect and build trustworthiness with our audiences?
So we've got some very specific findings from the neuroscience experiments we've run on storytelling. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, attention is a scarce resource in the brain. And we find that for almost all short-form stories, so that excludes movies and novels, you've got about 15 seconds to capture attention. So if I don't get your attention in the first 15 seconds, whatever happens in the next 15 or 20 or 1 minute doesn't matter much, because your brain has sort of categorized this as an uninteresting effect. Having said that, every story doesn't work for every person. So, people who tell stories live, which includes me and you, we know that sometimes there are audience members who just disengage for whatever reason. So there are people who we can find who are behaviorally, we call super responders. And those people have the strongest attentional response in the first 15 seconds. So 2 take-homes from that. 15 seconds to grab attention, and if you can identify who is just digging this story like I'll get out in the first 15 seconds, they are your kind of super responders. So again, we do that neurologically, but you might be able to do that just being a careful observer of your audience. So these people may be the evangelists for you for whatever mission you want to go on, and so it's useful to think about who those people are. I live in LA, and so in LA and in Hollywood speak, we call that a hot open, right? So I want to open hot. I want to capture your attention right away. If I have to lay out 15 different conditions and talk about it's not going to work. So lead with a story, and that story's got to have something that's going to capture my attention. And the second key component is to generate this increasing tension, so I continue to pay attention and I start to care about the characters in the story. So we do that through conflict. So stories that are told at human scale, that is, that involve specific individuals as opposed to big ideas or groups of individuals, tend to be more engaging because you can generate specific conflict. So I may be concerned about, people cutting down the rainforest in the Amazon, but I can articulate that story by talking about one indigenous farmer who lives in the Amazon, and his ancestors for thousands of years have farmed a particular type of tree, harvested this tree, and that's a much more compelling story than a factoid like every day 4,000 acres of the rainforest is cut down. Mm-hmm. So once you have that human scale story, then the story has to go somewhere. So you've got to develop characters with a goal and characters that really show their emotions. So often in the business world, we're kind of told to be robots, It's all about
Yep.
the numbers, Bob. It's just about the numbers, not personal. But in fact, we can't turn off our emotions. We can suppress them, but we can't turn them off. And so for storytellers in the business world, you need to empower yourself to show those emotions. So you can talk about the emotions of the people in your story, but it's better if you can actually reveal those emotions yourself, if you are the vessel through which the character's emotions are delivered to your audience. And then once you have that emotional engagement by the audience, or a big subset of the audience, hopefully, then you have to allow whatever conflict's occurring to resolve. And once that conflict resolves, there is an opportunity to put in an implicit or explicit call to action. So now something has happened. We are attracted to stories because we learn things about what the other humans are doing. And once you show how your hero has resolved his or her story, then it's time to let your audience understand that they too could be in a similar situation, and they too may want to emulate what the hero in your story did.
Mm-hmm. It's all about creating meaning, I guess, and our mind's absolute thirst for creating meaning in everything that's happening around us. And when we just bombard people with data, PowerPoint, bullet points, charts and graphs, there's not a lot of meaning associated with that to our mind, and it starts scrambling to develop its own meaning. And in my experience is when business leaders use story, even just a little bit, I say a spoonful of story helps the data go down. They don't have to tell epic journeys, but little anecdotes around the data that they're trying to express. It just ignites the brain, the subconscious, and I've seen it with our students. And in some cases, you typically end up with students that are terrific at presenting their story, and then you end up with a handful of them that just didn't quite get there. Yet, when they use some of the most basic story structure, and even if their presentation technique wasn't the greatest, there was just simply something about that structure that seemed to resonate with the subconscious of the audiences. And when they were done, the audiences would come up and say, "Wow, Brad," or whomever, "that's the best presentation I've seen you make. That's fantastic." And I've heard those reports come back time and time again. And I think it's just the basic structure of story. Even a poorly told story just seems to connect and resonate with the mind. And I'm wondering if you've seen that as well.
We have. I was talking to a filmmaker named Ted Frank a couple of weeks ago. He was filming me talking about storytelling. And how these filming go. On a break, we're chatting, and he said, "Our brains are built for story." And I said, "Well, I got to put my scientist hat on." Our brains, in a very real neurologic sense, are built for social behaviors. Human beings are extraordinarily social, much more social than any other mammal. That means that we're very sensitive to social information. And so I agree with you that when we present social information in the form of a story, our brains really engage. They don't engage so much when the social information or any information is told as facts. So because we're such social creatures, stories, particularly good stories, resonate with us. But again, these constraints, having enough tension, understanding that attention is a scarce resource, and allowing that tension to resolve are also very important. But this goes back to 2,600 years ago for Aristotle. So I should note, Park, that as you know, there's an animation of me talking about this that you can find online, a short video called Empathy, Neurochemistry, and the Dramatic Arc. And if you just Google that or YouTube it, you'll find kind of an overview of this in 6 minutes, which also resolves hopefully the skeptical audience brain engaging right now, which is, gosh, either it's trivial because I've heard all this before, or how the heck can they know this? So again, we've spent 10 years and about $2.5 million doing funded research to identify neurologically what's happening in the brain during effective stories, and in particular, again, correlating that brain activity to action. And just to put a fine point on it, oxytocin is a chemical your brain makes, but we can also safely shoot synthetic oxytocin into the brain. And when we do that during effective stories, we find that people are more immersed in the stories, they care more about the characters, and they're substantially more likely to, in this case, donate to a charity associated with a cause shown in that story. So it tells us that that's the kind of the key action button that you need to get from story, which is you've got to turn on that oxytocin, empathy, emotional resonance connection. And when it happens, then the sort of floodgates open up, and then you can actually influence people to do things that hopefully are good for them, good for the organization, good for society.
So how do you get your subjects to allow you to put a gigantic syringe in their head to shoot oxytocin into their brains?
Yeah, we use these really giant needles and we shove them in the no. So we can have shown we can safely spray oxytocin into your sinus cavities, and after about an hour, enough of that leaks into your brain to affect your behavior. So it's not super pleasant, but it's not a big needle either. So it's very safe, and all this is approved by the ethics committee at my university. So 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 we have a causal relationship via the oxytocin infusion that tells us that if I get attention and I can get the brain to make oxytocin, then I've really got you captured. And even when we do follow-ups a week later, in those cases, people remember the story better. They understand that they say that the experience of being in the experiment, or in corporate work we've done, of being in this consumer experience, like the shopping experience, is better when there's a story. And they're, again, happier. It drives things like customer loyalty. So, for business people that are outward facing, think about creating a customer experience around a story that's immersive, that flows like a story arc, that has a resolution and has an opportunity to act within that. So it's kind of like creating a story for the consumer to find themselves in, because we do love story.
And by the way, you can find that animation that Paul was talking about. It's about a 5-minute piece on the Future of Storytelling website. That's where I found it, and I've used it. I put it into my blog as well, and it's really quite fascinating what he's found in that. And when we come back after this message from our sponsor, I would like Paul to talk about the different studies that they've done, that he just hasn't randomly connected these dots. I mean, you've done a study of people giving away money to strangers and to see if those strangers would reciprocate and give money back. You studied a bride and groom of a wedding party of complete strangers in South London with this, and then you traveled as far as Papua New Guinea to try it on the tribesmen there. So when we come back, tell us a little bit more about what you found in your studies so that we can get the skeptics, talk to the skeptics about storytelling and explain to them, no, this is not a gimmick that these professional persuaders use on you, but it's how our brains are truly hardwired for story. So right after this.
Your customers, employees, marketing campaigns, partners, and yes, your detractors, they're each telling a story right now about you. Where? On social media, in traditional print publications, in blog posts, on television, basically everywhere. And it's happening 24/7, in real time. Your mission? Track these stories and the sources that share them, smartly manage them, analyze them rapidly, and discern what you should do next, what you should do now. No wonder you're tired. Well, Signal Labs is a real-time, cross-media story tracking platform that makes your life easier. Their solution enables customers to quickly spot trends, see relevant stories unfold, and take action. So stay ahead of what the world thinks with Signal Labs. Learn more and sign up for a free demo at signallabs.com/story.
Welcome back to the Business of Story, and our guest today, Dr. Paul Zak. Now, Paul, we talked about your skepticism as a scientist in studying oxytocin. How does it really get released, and does story really release it? And you would run a test. This is at least what I took away from your TED Talk, and then even kind of doubt the findings and run a next test, to corroborate those findings. So tell us about that. I think it started with giving away money to strangers, and would those strangers reciprocate and give money back? And how did that release oxytocin? Then I think you told us about being a stranger in a very large wedding party in South London and how they opened themselves up to your studies. and then you finally ended up in Papua New Guinea. Tell us about that, please.
Right. So you can measure oxytocin, even though it's a kind of a fragile molecule, by doing blood draws. So all of our early studies involved taking blood before and after people had some kind of social interaction. And we wanted to know, number one, if those random social interactions would cause oxytocin release, number one, and number two, whether the oxytocin would affect your behavior. And as you said, we began the laboratory in really simple tasks where people could share money with others, denoting trust, and the person who got the money could either keep it all or share it back. And indeed, when we are trusted, our brains make oxytocin, and the more we're trusted with money, the more oxytocin we release, and actually the more we reciprocate. Even though you think, in this classical models in economics, if someone gives you money and you don't have to do anything, there's no contract, isn't money the be-all and end-all of life? You should just keep it all. But almost no one does that. And in fact, the people who do that have many of the attributes of psychopaths. Because we kind of know, right? You have to sort of go along to get along. And so oxytocin, again, is that nice golden rule-like reciprocating chemical. But once we had spent a couple years in the lab and beat on this thing every different way, including the oxytocin infusion to the brain, we've gone in the field and taken blood before and after really what we call in science ecologically valid settings. So not the sterile laboratory setting where I control everything, but the messy real world in which all of us live. So including taking blood from the wedding party before and after they say their vows. We were really concerned that the effects we were seeing were only driven by wealthy, well-fed, educated Westerners, which is where our laboratory studies were mostly done. So I went to the rainforest of Papua New Guinea for a week and took blood from indigenous peoples before and after they did a ritual war dance that their ancestors have done for thousands of years. And that dance itself, even though they're not at war with anybody, is a great builder of community bonds via the release of oxytocin. So there are reasons that we have these rituals. I think from the work we're doing now, we're doing a lot more focused work on how to test ads. We can now measure oxytocin using wireless sensors, and as well as its attentional responses. And we've developed a measure we call Zest. How much zest does your story have? And the story could be an ad or a consumer experience or a ritual. Zest stands for Zach Engagement Statistics. So we mathematically derive this measure, and it strongly predicts how well an ad will do in market. So higher Zest score tells me that this is more engaging for people's brains, and it's more influential when it goes out in the marketplace. So I'll give you a concrete example, because I know we have business people listening. This is just released a couple weeks ago. We did a project with one of our partners, SalesBrain, for a little company you may have heard of called Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So Facebook gets about 2/3 of their ad revenue now from mobile devices. And they were concerned that ads on mobile devices would be less engaging neurologically and therefore potentially less motivating towards action than ads seen on a big screen. And so we ran a study in which we put these wireless sensors on people, collecting it 1,000 times a second coming out of their brain, had them watch the same set of ads on a small screen and a big screen, and we found that at least for the 4 ads we tested, 3 of the 4 are actually more engaging on the small screen than the big screen.
How come?
Yeah, how come is right. I mean, they attract more attention, your brain's less distracted, the emotional responses are stronger, and the actions after the ads are more likely to occur. We don't really know why. It looks like that screen, first of all, you're holding it, so it's an active task. You're moving it around a little bit, which forces you to pay more attention to it, where the monitor on the wall or on your desktop is just sitting there, and it's easier to be distracted. So we'll continue to study why that has occurred. But it's a really good question, right? And the nice thing about using neuroscience to answer that question is you don't depend on self-report or how much I like my phone or whatever. We can actually just go and test not only if it's more compelling, but how much more, right? The Zest measure is a linear measure of the brain's engagement in this story. And so once we have that measure, then you can say, well, this specific ad on a mobile device was 72% more engaging for the 60 people we tested than this same ad on a 17-inch monitor. So I think we're really into a world where we can blend the art and the science of storytelling. My group, we can't make stories. I mean, I can certainly guide you on how to make a good story, but when you have a story, we can tell you what it should contain to make it good, and we can test it, and we can test different versions of it. So, again, for listeners, you don't have to do this using neuroscience, but Park, I'm sure you'll agree with me, you got to practice and practice and practice and workshop and refine. Storytelling is like any other skill. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And if you know the basic outlines that you're trying to hit, try it in a couple different audiences. Try it at small scale before you release it, everywhere. Steve Jobs was famous for being an excessive practicer of his big announcements for Apple because he wanted them to look seamless. And so I think for all of us, given the advice of your work and what we've talked about today, knowing the content but delivering it in a really excellent way really makes a big difference, again, when you're trying to move people to action.
Paul, with the work you've done in Zest, are you coming to the conclusion, or at least maybe I'm making this up in my mind, that the fact that you've got a mobile device and it's literally attached to you where other devices are not, you're staring at it from afar, it's attached to your hand, you're looking at it, it causes you to focus on it, so you have a bit of a captive audience in and of yourself. Does that mean that stories don't have to be quite as good on a mobile device because you are physically focused on it, or what do you think about that?
That's a great question. I don't think we fully know the answer. We're still studying this, but at least preliminarily, it looks like, from the brain's perspective, a good story is a good story is a good story. So if it's a good story, through whatever medium I am, transmitting it to you, your brain will engage. And if it's a bad story, it's a bad story, and your brain will disengage. So the one story, when we looked at it for Facebook, that was better on the big monitor than on the small screen, honestly was a very poor story. Structurally, it was a very poor story. It was too long. It had too many jumps in it. This is a video, actually advertisement for the movie Entourage. It was just very poorly done. So, for any of us who know about story structure, you would look at that and go, who made that little clip? That's just awful. Where the other, we tested actually almost all ads for movies, upcoming movies, and the other movie clips had a little dramatic arc there. So it introduced the characters. There was some conflict, something happened, you want to find out. So storytelling can be done, even in the very short form. So we've actually tested commercials as short as 15 seconds and found them to be very engaging if they're well thought out, well structured, and well produced. So again, that's the sort of preparation. If you think about story as a way to influence others, then you've got to think about having a really tight story. Even if you're just using this to open up your presentation with lots of data, it's got to be compelling and on target. I should also say, we've seen some wonderful ads that we've tested. We did a project for the large advertising agency BBDO a couple months ago, and they've made some extraordinarily good ads, and they have very high Zest scores. But some of those ads do not fit the product very well. So in market, they don't do as well as they could because there's a lack of congruence between the communication, the story, and the product. So again, think about your audience for the people listening. If the audience is full of business people and I'm telling a story about, I don't know, the homeless guy I saw last week, it may not appeal to them. It may not be relevant to the story you're telling. So, one of the great sayings about writing is, don't write what you need to say, write what the reader needs to learn or hear. And so I think the same thing's for storytelling. Tell the story that's going to be engaging for the audience that you want to reach, not a story that you like because it amuses you or you find compelling. And that takes that's the preparation. It takes some work.
Paul, where can we find out more about Zest?
You can go to our ZestX Labs website. It's zestxlabs.com. or you can just Google me, Paul Zach, and you'll find links to everything I'm doing. And all these articles, by the way, for our hopefully our good skeptical listeners, online I have all our scientific papers, as well as lots of magazine articles and media that I've done talking about this. So lots of resources for people who want to build better stories. And happy to help people who have questions. Reach out.
So in a quick recap, and I appreciate that, Paul, story, you've got to open hot. You have to have a ball in play. You have to get the attention of the listener or the viewer or the people you're in front of, and you got about 15 seconds to do that, or maybe even shorter. I read something the other day that now the goldfish has a longer attention span than the average human thanks to the attention economy, so we're weighing in at about 8 seconds. Then the story has to create real conflict and build conflict and take your audience somewhere. And I think that is true in every guest we've had is talking about adding conflict. You have to have it. It's the marrow of every story. And in business, we're kind of nervous about talking about conflict, which leads to the next point. As a storyteller, you need to be able to be vulnerable and empower yourself to show the emotion. I think you said to be the vessel, to transport the emotion of the hero in your story so that you can connect with your audiences. Release that oxytocin and have them appreciate, trust what you're telling them, and have them start living vicariously through the protagonist within your story. And then finally, it's about resolution. So really, even though I covered 4 points here, it's a 3-act structure of open hot in your exposition. In Act 2, take them through conflict, put them through hell, bring them back again, which again releases cortisol, dopamine, and oxytocin, that all-important moral molecule. And then finally bring them to resolution so that every story has meaning to it for the brain. So my final question to you, Paul, with the skeptics out there, if you were me standing in front of all those cross-armed sustainability executives and engineers and PhDs who somewhat scoffed and dismissed the approach of communication as being the soft skill, what should I have said, or what would you have said to that audience to get them to go, oh, I get it now?
That's a deep question, but I think the short answer is the soft skills are the hardest to obtain. And the reason you're here is because even though we all think we write well and speak well, we all can get better at that. And if you want to influence the other humans around you, these are the hard skills that you've got to acquire. Physics is easy. I can run experiments in physics over and over and over and get those little molecules to do whatever in a vacuum. But human behavior is really complicated. So one example I give very, very briefly is, since I know you so well, Park, I know that you like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla. And if I ask you why, you're going to give me some roundabout answer because it's complicated. So humans are complicated. We don't know what we like. We can't always articulate our inner world, what we're feeling, why we do things. And because we're complicated, we don't have a clear runway to access, where I want you to go. So I've got to think about more effective ways to influence people, to motivate them, to engage them. And storytelling is something that our brains just love. So when you get good at that skill, it becomes a really valuable skill to have in your tool belt.
Oh. Well, thank you, Paul. And I'm so encourage all of you, if you want to learn more about the science behind story, just do a Google on Dr. Paul Zach. He is more than generous with his information. He has very compelling and interesting presentations, and I have learned so much from you and your work that I've been able to share with our students and with our clients here at Park & Co. And thank you again for taking the time to visit us on Business of Story.
Thank you so much, Park. It's a pleasure.
All right. Now, if you like what you're hearing, please rate the show, review the show, subscribe, share it with your world, throw a story around why you like it, because we're all about building that trustworthiness and bringing value to your life as a business leader, brand communicator, content marketer, sustainability executive. Whatever you need to do in your life to help propel your mission and your quests further, faster, I have not found anything more powerful than storytelling to help you connect and build trustworthiness with your audiences and make it happen. So thank you for visiting us. And one last place I'll send you is to thebusinessofstory.com. We have a number of tools that you can download right there to start building your repertoire around storytelling. So join us again in 2 weeks when we will be back with another compelling guest on the Business of Story. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to The Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Park & Co., Signal Labs, and ACT, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts.